everybody, and welcome to our ongoing celebration of Elvis Week 2024. Today we're answering a rather sad but meaningful and important question, which is, where were you when Elvis died? Now, obviously, I am a dumb Zoomer, and I was not around when Elvis died. In fact, the first celebrity deaths that I actually remember as a teenager and stuff, the big ones that I remember where I was when Michael Jackson died, or rather when I heard the news. I was eating breakfast, getting ready for school. I remember where I was when David Bowie died. I was getting ready for school. And I remember where I was when Prince died. Can you guess? It is very sad, obviously, but a lot of times it does beckon in new fans. It beckons in kind of in a weird, morbid way. It beckons in more interest and can really turn into a celebration of life rather than a mourning of death, you know? So maybe that's what this article is. I'm not really sure. I did want to, before we got started, say that because I've posted a couple of videos now for Elvis Week, and I've gotten great responses, and I really appreciate that. But there were a couple of people who, without even me asking, provided their own stories of where they were when Elvis died. And so I wanted to share a couple of those because I find this stuff pretty poignant. I'll put this up on the screen as well, but I'm just going to read it off my phone here. I was 24 years old with two sons aged 3 and 4 months the day Elvis died. We were on our way home when the news came on the radio that Elvis had died. I immediately pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store, and my spouse and I sat there in shock for a few minutes. Then tears came, and we hugged each other. We'd both grown up with parents who were huge fans, so we were practically born being fans of Elvis Presley. Saw all of his movies, bought his music, and watched his specials. Elvis's death was treated much the same as when President Kennedy died. It was in newspapers around the world, his funeral procession was on TV, and there were TV specials about him on all 3 major TV networks. Besides his amazing talent, people felt connected to Elvis because he was a regular guy like most of us were, and it was clear that he loved entertaining people. He came across as humble and real, just a down-home guy who made it good and wanted to share his love of music with everyone. A generous, entertaining, and humble man who did his best to deal with being the first international rock and roll superstar. He walked that walk on his own. As the Beatles said, they had each other to deal with the fame, and Elvis had come before them to pave the way. So sad that his life was cut short, especially for his daughter, Lisa Marie, but also for his legions of fans. Well said. We have another one here, a little shorter. I was 23 years old and had 2 sons at that time, aged 2 and 5, on the day he passed away. I was in disbelief when I first heard the news, but when the realization set in, I cried for days, and it was several years before I could listen to Elvis sing My Way without breaking into tears. Thank you for sharing that, guys. I do find that interesting to hear. With that said, let's go ahead and read this article here, which was originally published August 29th, 1977. I have not read this article. I have no idea what it says. So let's see. Where were you when Elvis died? Lester Bangs recalled his erection of the heart when he said goodbye to the king. Oh, okay. How Long Will We Care is apparently the original title. Where were you when Elvis died? What were you doing, and what did it give you an excuse to do with the rest of your day? That's what we'll be talking about in the future when we remember this grand occasion. Like Pearl Harbor or JFK's assassination, it boiled down to individual reminiscences, which is perhaps as it should be, because in spite of his greatness, blah blah blah, Elvis has left each of us as alone as he was. I mean, he wasn't exactly a man of the people anymore, if you get my drift. If you don't, I will drift even further, away from Elvis into contemplation of why all our public heroes seem to reinforce our own solitude. The ultimate sin of any performer is contempt for the audience. Those who indulge in it will ultimately reap the scorn of those they've dumped on, whether they live forever like Andy Paleface Warhol, or die fashionably early like Lenny Bruce, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday. The 2 things that distinguish those deaths from Elvis's, he and they having drug habits vaguely in common, were that all of them died on the outside looking in, and none of them took their audience for granted, which is why it's just a little bit harder for me to see Elvis as a tragic figure. I see him as being more like the Pentagon, this giant armored institution nobody knows anything about, except that its power is legendary. Obviously, we all liked Elvis better than the Pentagon, but look at what a paltry statement that is. In the end, Elvis's scorn for his fans, as manifested in new albums full of previously released material and one new song to make sure all us suckers would buy it, was mirrored in the scorn we all secretly or not so secretly felt for a man who came closer to godhood than Carlos Costanza. Until military conscription tamed and revealed him for the dumb lackey he always was in the first place. God damn, what is this? Is this a hit piece? And ever since, for almost 2 decades now, we've been waiting for him to get wild again. Fools that we are. And he probably knew better than any of us in his heart of hearts that it was never going to happen. His heart of hearts so obviously not being our collective heart of hearts. He so obviously just some poor dumb southern boy with a big daddy manager to screen the world for him and filter out anything which might erode his status as big strapping baby bringing home the bucks, and finally being sort of perversely celebrated at least by rock critics for his utter contempt for his audience. And Elvis was perverse. Only a true pervert could release something like Having Fun with Elvis on Stage. That album released 3 or so years back, which consisted entirely of between-song onstage patter so redundant it would make both Willie Burroughs and Gert Stein blush. Ah yes. Hot off the presses topical reference there, buddy, I definitely got that. Elvis was into marketing boredom when Andy Warhol was still doing shoe ads, but Elvis's sin was his failure to realize that his fans were not perverse. They loved him without qualification. No matter what he dumped on them, they loyally lapped it up. And that's why I feel a hell of a lot sorrier for all of those poor jerks than for Elvis himself now. I mean, who's left they can stand all night in the rain for? Nobody. And the true tragedy is the tragedy of an entire generation which refuses to give up its adolescence, and even as it feels its menopausal paunch beginning to blossom and its hair recede over the horizon, along with Elvis and everything else they once thought they believed in. Will they care in 5 years what he's been doing for the last 20? Ha! Who had the last laugh there, buddy? All those Elvis fans who won't shut the hell up. Shout out to you guys. Sure, Elvis's death is a relatively minor, ironic variant of the future shock mazurka, and perhaps the most significant thing about Elvis's exit is that the entire history of the 70s has been retreads and brutal demystification. 3 of Elvis's ex-bodyguards recently got together with this hacker from the New York Post and whipped up a book, which dosed us all with the dirt we'd yearned for so long. Elvis was the last of our sacred cows to be publicly mutilated. Everyone knows Keith Richards likes his junk, but when Elvis went on stage in a stupor, nobody breathed a hint of Quaalude. In a way, this was both good and bad. Good because Elvis wasn't encouraging other people to think it was cool to be a walking physician's desk reference. Bad because Elvis stood for that Nixonian secrecy as virtue, which was passed off as the essence of Americanism for a few years there. In a sense, he could be seen not only as a phenomenon that exploded in the 50s to help shape the psychic jailbreak of the 60s, but ultimately as a perfect cultural expression of what the Nixon years were all about. Not that he prospered more then, but that his passion for the privacy of potentates... I don't know these words, guys. Not that he prospered more then, but that his passion for the privacy of potentates allowed him to get away with almost literal murder, certainly with the symbolic rape of his fans, meaning that we might all do better to think about waving goodbye with one upraised finger. I got the news of Elvis's death while drinking beer with a friend and fellow music journalist on his fire escape on 21st Street in Chelsea. Chelsea's a good neighborhood in spite of the fact that the insane woman who lives upstairs keeps him awake all night every night with her rants at no one. My friend stays there because he likes the sense of community within diversity in that neighborhood. Old-time card-carrying communists live in his building alongside people of every persuasion popularly lumped as ethnic. When he heard about Elvis, we knew a wake was in order, so I went out to the deli for a case of beer. As I left the building, I passed some Latin guys hanging out by the front door. Heard the news? Elvis is dead, I told them. They looked at me with contemptuous indifference. So what? Maybe if I had told them Donna Summer was dead, I might have gotten a reaction. I do recall walking in this neighborhood wearing a t-shirt that said "Disco Sucks," with a vast unamused muttering in my wake, which only goes to show that not for everyone was Elvis the still reigning king of rock and roll. In fact, not for everyone is rock and roll the still reigning music. By now, every citizen has found his own little obsessive corner to blast his brains in. As the 60s were supremely narcissistic, solipsism is what the 70s have been about. And nowhere is this better demonstrated than in the world of pop, music. And Elvis may have been the greatest solipsist of all. I asked for 2 six-packs at the deli and told the guy behind the counter the news. He looked 50 years old, graying, big belly, life still in his eyes, and he said, "Shit, that's too bad. I guess our only hope now is if the Beatles get back together." 50 years old. I told him I thought that would be the biggest anticlimax in history and that the best thing the Stones could do now would be to break up and spare us all further embarrassments. This guy kind of seems a little mean. He laughed and gave me directions to a meat market down the street. There I asked the counterman the same question I had been asking everyone. He was in his 50s too, and he said, "You know what? I don't care that bastard's dead. I took my wife to see him in Vegas in '73. We paid $14 a ticket, and he came out and sang for 20 minutes. Then he fell down. Then he stood up and sang a couple more songs. Then he fell down again. Finally, he said, well shit, I might as well sit singing as standing. So he squatted on the stage and asked the band what song they wanted to do next, but before they could answer, he was complaining about the lights. They're too bright, he says. They hurt my eyes. Put 'em out or I don't sing a note. So they do. So me and my wife are sitting in total blackness listening to this guy sing songs we knew and loved, and I ain't just talking about his old goddamn songs, but he totally butchered all of them. Fuck him. I'm not saying I'm glad he's dead, but I know one thing. I got taken when I went to see Elvis Presley. I got taken too the one time I saw Elvis, but in a totally different way. It was the autumn of 1971, and 2 tickets to an Elvis show turned up at the offices of Cream magazine where I was then employed. It was decided that those staff members who had never had the privilege of witnessing Elvis should get the tickets, which was how me and art director Charlie Arringer ended up in nearly the front row of the biggest arena in Detroit. Earlier, Charlie had said, "Do you realize how much we could get if we sold these fucking things?" I didn't, but how precious they were became totally clear the instant Elvis sauntered onto the stage. He was the only male performer I have ever seen to whom I responded sexually. It wasn't real arousal, rather an erection of the heart. When I looked at him, I went mad with desire and envy and worship and self-projection. I mean, Mick Jagger, whom I saw as far back as 1964 and twice in 65, never even came close. There was Elvis, dressed up in this totally ridiculous white suit, which looked like some studded Arthurian castle, and he was too fat, and the buckle on his belt was as big as your head, except that your head is not made of solid gold, and any lesser man would have been the spitting image of a Neil Diamond damn fool in such a getup, but on Elvis it fit. What didn't? No matter how lousy his records ever got, no matter how intently he pursued mediocrity, there was still some hint, some flash left over from the days when, well, I wasn't there, so I won't presume to comment, but I will say this. Elvis Presley was the man who brought overt, blatant, vulgar sexual frenzy to the popular arts in America, and thereby to the nation itself, since putting popular arts in America in the same sentence seems almost redundant. It has been said that he was the first white to sing like a black person, which is untrue in terms of hard facts, but totally true in terms of cultural impact. That's. But what's more crucial is that when Elvis started wiggling his hips and Ed Sullivan refused to show it, the entire country went into a paroxysm of sexual frustration, leading to abiding discontent, which culminated in the explosion of psychedelic militant folklore, which was the 60s. I mean, don't tell me about Lenny Bruce, man. Lenny Bruce said dirty words in public and obtained a kind of consensual martyrdom, plus which Lenny Bruce was hip. Too goddamn hip if you ask me, which was his undoing, whereas Elvis was not hip at all. Elvis was a goddamn truck driver who worshipped his mother and would never say shit or fuck around her, and Elvis alerted America to the fact that it had a groin with imperatives that had been stifled. Lenny Bruce demonstrated how far you could push a society as repressed as ours and how much you could get away with, but Elvis kicked "How much is that doggy in the window" out the window and replaced it with "Let's fuck." The rest of us are still reeling from the impact. Obviously, sexual chaos reigns currently, but out of chaos may flow true understanding and harmony, and either way, Elvis almost single-handedly opened the floodgates. That night in Detroit, a night I will never forget, he had but to ever so slightly move one shoulder muscle, not even a shrug, and the girls in the gallery, hit by its ray, screamed, fainted, howled in heat. Literally, every time this man moved any part of his body the slightest centimeter, tens of thousands of people went berserk. Not Sinatra, not Jagger, not the Beatles, nobody you can come up with ever elicited such hysteria among so many. I will say I have seen that Michael Jackson video where he's just standing there and then he'll turn his head and then everybody faints in the crowd. I do want to be an ass and point that out, but that's okay. And this after a decade and a half of crappy records, of making a point of not trying. If love truly is going out of fashion forever, which I do not believe, then along with our nurtured indifference to each other will be an even more contemptuous indifference to each other's objects of reverence. I thought it was Iggy Stooge, you thought it was Joni Mitchell, or whoever else seemed to speak for your own private, entirely circumscribed situations, many pains and few ecstasies. We will continue to fragment in this manner because solipsism holds all the cards at present. It is a king whose domain engulfs even Elvis's. But I can guarantee you one thing. We will never again agree on anything as we agreed on Elvis. So I won't even bother saying goodbye to his corpse. I will say goodbye to you. Well, that was certainly not a perspective on Elvis that anybody has shared with me before. That was kind of crazy. There are things that he says that I agree with, and things that he says that I don't. I do think that as a society, and with the advent of social media and whatnot, that we've only gotten more self-absorbed, and I would agree that we are often contemptuous of other people's objects of reverence, AKA that's just called being a hater. If you see someone else enjoying something, you're just going to hate on them because you're not enjoying yourself, or like, you're not enjoying what you've got going on in life. I do agree that that phenomenon has been amplified. However, his general thesis statement, I don't fully agree with, wherein he's talking about how many people are going to care at this point. I can't speak to the mediocrity alleged of his records in the 60s. I do know that the reputation is that his movies are schlocky and unwatchable at worst. And just from the familiarity that I have gleaned thus far in listening to his music, it did seem like the 60s were musically less productive or prolific for him. But I don't know that I agree that that's a contempt for his fans. I don't know that I agree with that as much as him being a classic story of overindulgence in drugs and kind of losing sense of yourself, and also when you are that famous, being under such a watchful eye and being under such intense scrutiny at all times that moving your body a centimeter makes people go berserk would be an extremely, extremely isolating thing. And a lot of people would turn to drugs if they're not surrounded by the right people. If they're surrounded by people like Tom Parker, who are looking to make a buck off him and not necessarily out for his best interests. There's a lot of reason, and like has been said a million times, there was no roadmap. He was the pioneer of it, so that's what I take issue with the most. But of course, I have only ever heard from Elvis fans on my channel, and I have only now seen secondary things relating to him having a generous heart. So I don't want to say that his claims are unfounded, but they are not consistent with what I have found to be the case thus far. And of course, again, the most egregious thing is that he says that nobody's going to care in 5 years what he was doing for the last 20. Here we are 50 years later, and I'm enjoying the music. I'm interested, I'm interested in the trajectory of the truck driver who worships his mom becoming the guy who reminded people that their groins have a function, That's an interesting story. I really am shocked at the tone of this. I didn't expect it to be so critical of him. But to each their own. That's what it's all about, I don't know who Lester Bangs is. I don't know anything about him. I'm sure he's a very storied critic, and he's clearly a very good writer. He's popping out with words I never heard before in my life. But he seemed to not be the biggest Elvis fan, or at least to see him as just to see him as a little lesser. A little Lester. I'm sorry. I'm just going to leave it there. We're just going to end it there. It was so bad. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Bye, everybody. Jesus. Bye. Oh, my God.